Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second in our series of creative conversations. Tonight, we're really delighted to welcome the artist Somaya Critchlow and curator Isabel Seligman, who will be in conversation this evening. They're going to be exploring their understanding of the art of the past and the present, particularly looking at the legacy of artistic movements such as Surrealism, and examining ideas about representation, the body and the nude, and reflecting, of course, on the relationship between drawing and other kinds of artistic practice. And both Somaya and Isabel have strong connections to the Royal Drawing School, so it's really lovely to welcome them back here, albeit virtually. So to introduce them both, Somaya Critchlow studied at the Royal Drawing School and the University of Brighton, and she's known for her small-scale works, which depict bold, curvaceous, and self-possessed female characters of her own creation. Imbued with dark, rich hues of browns, Payne's grey and purples, and using sensuous brushstrokes, her heroines emerge starkly against atmospheric backdrops of thinned oils evocative of classical European painting, such as Velázquez and Rubens, and David Lynch's hazy, seedy, and environs. They're self-reflective and personal, and at the same time a commentary on the cultural, class and political dynamics of contemporary society. Somaya Critchlow has most recently exhibited in New York at Jeffrey Deitch, Karma, and the Fortnight Institute, and at Maximillian William in London. And her work is included in numerous collections, including the Baltimore Museum of Art, ICA Miami, and the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Art in Norwich. So it's wonderful to have Isabel Seligman in conversation with Somaya, as one of her main research interests is the intersection of contemporary drawing with historical forms, processes, and techniques. As the Monument Trust Curator of Modern and Contemporary Drawing at the British Museum in the Department of Prints and Drawings, Isabel has curated touring exhibitions, including Lines of Thought, Drawing from Michelangelo to Now, which was in 2016, and Pushing Paper, Contemporary Drawing from 1970 to Now in 2019. And that was part of, or has been part of, the Bridget Riley Art Foundation project to encourage artists and art students to engage with drawings in the collection. And that's made a real difference to the Royal Drawing School students in their visits to the British Museum. And we've really enjoyed Isabel's support with this. So before I hand over to Somaya and Isabel, for their conversation, I'd just like to remind everyone that we do really welcome your comments and questions. And you can use the chat box throughout the talk to add your comments and questions, or you can wait to the end and you'll be invited to raise your hand. So you'll be invited to ask your question by raising your hand in the participants tab. So that should be straightforward. Welcome, Somaya and Isabel. There you are, wonderful.
Thanks so much, Claudia.
Some images coming up.
Right, let me hope that the tech gods are smiling on us. Can you see?
Wonderful. Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks so much, Claudia. And thanks, Somaya. It's really wonderful to be able to have this opportunity to have this conversation, having had us only being speaking on the phone up till now.
Likewise, it's nice to see your face.
So yeah, and thank you so much everyone for coming. I think maybe let's just dive straight in, and this pair of paintings that we've got up here at the moment, I think this is a really wonderful example of some of the ways that your work kind of draws on work from the past and sort of converses with it in the present. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the process behind this particular work and how it came into being.
Yeah, so it was, I basically went to see this exhibition at the Tate, Britain, and it was called, I think, Baroque, Illusion and Power, and it was all about the Baroque and I walked into one room, and I really love it when exhibitions have got quite like a scene set, and they had taken these portraits of the Petworth beauties from Petworth House and put some of them in a room. I think they were also mixed in with the Hampton Court beauties, and it really just like quite took me. It was just a strong visual image, and like seeing these paintings, and then I sort of, I guess subconsciously, I didn't think about it whilst I was making the painting Petworth Beauty Abigail, but afterwards I sort of put two and two together. And then I also thought it was quite a funny idea, thinking about, you know, you get in these sort of seedy magazines, which I sometimes look at for reference imagery, the idea of, you know, pet of the month. And in a way it had a similar vibe, because the portraits that were commissioned, you know, that they were all the most beautiful women in the court. And it's just, it was quite a funny ideology. I know it just sounded right also.
Absolutely. But I mean, you're so right, that exhibition, sort of British Baroque power and illusion, the emphasis here is really on the power.
Yeah.
And, you know, in this era, a woman's beauty kind of was her power in this patriarchal society. You know, that is her sort of moral standing as well. It's, you know, in a society which values women for their beauty, that is what they have to offer. But at the same time, they are, you know, these women who were friends and favorites of Queen Anne, you know, who does have the real political power. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. But also maybe it would be a good moment to talk about scale in your works. I mean, going on to, if I can just move on to the next slide, yeah, there, looking at these works in situ, you can see how kind of monumental and imposing they are in scale. And I thought it would be a good moment to remind people of the scale of some of your work. So this is Untitled Pink Hair, and then this is the work in an install shot in the role play exhibition. And yeah, could you maybe speak a little bit about sort of how you use scale in your work and what it means to you?
Yeah, I think scale was something that I didn't ever think too much about, other than that I think I had always naturally been drawn to making things that are smaller. And I've often said I think this might be an element of personality and being quite wanting to be in control. And obviously when you're working on a smaller canvas, you have a lot more control. But I actually started working small scale because after being at the drawing school, what I really wanted to do was to work from my imagination. And to do that, you know, you sort of need to work out more ideas. So it made sense for me to start on a small scale. And I'd gone to the National Gallery with my grandfather, and we'd had a conversation about, you know, how the old masters did a lot of small miniature paintings and then scaled them up to larger paintings. So that was kind of the initial idea, that I was going to like work out my ideas on this much smaller scale and then scale it up. But something about the small scale sort of really took a hold of me, and I kind of got stuck there for quite a while, and it almost seemed unnecessary to scale them up. And it's actually quite interesting, sometimes when I have directly worked from a smaller painting and tried to make a bigger painting from it, I've learned so much, and that it's not actually possible to translate directly onto a larger scale. Like there will always be two totally separate paintings. And yeah, that was really interesting.
They'll have a completely different effect when they're the same sort of one-to-one, but on a different scale. Yeah,
exactly. And like the immediacy of, you know, you have this small canvas which can fit in your hand at times for me, and with like one brush stroke I could take out like half the canvas depending on what size brush I'm using. And I think it's a totally different energy than what you're faced with when you're working on a much bigger scale. And yeah, so they both sort of need their own how you relate to working on that scale. And I think it's so lovely to be able to work with something in your hands. And I also think the imagery is quite strong and affronting. So in a way, you know, I was quite surprised when I saw you know, when I put them on my studio wall, how powerful something so small could be.
Absolutely, but it's amazing because for me, as someone who first came to your works in reproduction rather than seeing them in the flesh, to then realize how small they were was like a really big shock, because they have this like incredible energy and monumentality, so it kind of works the other way as well. It's really amazing.
That's so funny to hear as well, because obviously you know, when you've made something, you can only ever see it through your own eyes, and it always knocked me when people like, or it took me by surprise when people go, oh, I thought that was so much bigger than it actually turned out to be, and I was always like, oh god, yeah, like for me, I just know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, talking about your time at the Royal Drawing School, maybe this would be a good moment to look at some of the works that you made while you were there, and particularly self-portrait as Cherry. Maybe you could talk a little bit about yeah, how that came about.
Yeah, so sort of in my time at the drawing school, I think, funnily enough, a lot of my experience was sort of how I was going to relate to myself as an artist and someone who was drawing, and working from this canon, this historical canon, where I sort of didn't really quite see myself or my contemporary interests or just what I was feeling, and kind of working through having been there for a really long time and just drawing a lot without thinking, which was something that I felt was really important to me, because I think a lot of the time, perhaps coming from art school, you are encouraged to justify something before you even know what's going on, to be honest. So kind of getting to this painting, it came through a process of me looking at myself. So obviously doing a lot of work in the life room and drawing from models. I then decided that I should maybe draw or paint myself. And my granddad had always said that was a good place to start if you weren't sure where to start, is to have a look at yourself. So I started working on a series of drawings of myself. And then there was a Max Beckmann painting, which we'll get to later, that really inspired me. And it was him sort of looking at, this one, with a cigarette. So I copied that pose and did a painting of it, and then go back to self-portrait with Cherry. Then I sort of was beginning to put together, you know, I don't know, the idea of using myself in there, but it not necessarily directly being myself, which I think when I say self-portrait as Cherry, it's almost like, it's more like a psychological version of myself, or you know, turning myself into an everyman.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, that's something that you know, in this Beckmann portrait, there is, you know, he's kind of oozing this sort of self-confidence and assurance, you know, it's something about the cigarette, but it is also that kind of role playing as well, because he's got that kind of polka dot sash at the bottom, and that kind of calls out his sort of, you know, him dressed as in a kind of circus costume, him as the clown. That idea that, you know, we think that we're being confronted with this sort of exposing of self, when actually, you know, it's all role play, it's all and
it's funny that you say that it sort of exudes a lot of confidence, and I really, at the time when I was doing that work, wasn't feeling very confident, and I think I saw this image and I thought, well, I want a piece of that. I want to share that moment and feel comfortable and confident. And it's so true, and it, you know, it makes me think of the Philip Guston in the slide of all the small ones, and just the idea of a mask, in that to almost look like you're trying to be yourself, you're putting on this exterior, I don't know, to get comfortable with how uncomfortable you are, you're masking up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, which maybe takes us on to these next slides. I mean, we were talking about the idea of self-portraiture and nude self-portraiture, and when we were thinking about images to include, we thought that this combination was a really amazing one, you know, separated by over 500 years. Yeah, I mean, such different contexts. I mean, Jura I doubt would have ever imagined that anyone would see this. And, you know, it's a very
Yeah, it's personal.
a very private thing, but at the same time it's, you know, born out of that exactly the same spirit that you started your self-portrait with, you know, just coming back to what do you have in front of you, and what does it mean, and how can I explore that?
Yeah, and looking at yourself, and yeah, and you know, I think there's such a brilliant story about the Barclay Hendricks painting, because he titled the work Brilliantly Self-Endowed, based on something that Hilton Kramer had written about his work in a review. And he had described him as being so skillful that it was too slick, too much slick realism, you know, brilliantly self-endowed. So what he did was then go and make this portrait as a kind of, you know, there's a sort of Black humor to it, isn't there? And being like, oh, you're going to call me out in that way.
Yeah, if you're going to deal me this backhander.
Yeah, I'll confront it straight on. Yeah, and I think it's interesting that relationship as well, with maybe saying that for Dürer it was more of a private thing that, yeah, he might not have expected anyone to see, and for, I don't know, yeah, to see them together is really intriguing.
But also, I mean, amazing kind of the way that they're both sort of cropped in interesting ways as well, like the Barclay Hendricks where he's like just sliced off the top of his hat and the bottom of his shoes, and then also the Dürer is kind of like he's sliced off at the bottom. I mean, I don't know whether that's something to do with the mirror that they were looking in. I mean, the mirror that Dürer would have used would have been really tight, but again it just kind of like gives them this immediacy, as if they're almost kind of like pressing into your space almost.
No, definitely. Yeah.
And yeah, moving on to yeah, I mean, nude self-portraiture by women, and these gorgeous photographs by Francesca Woodman, and I think you really get a palpable sense of the kind of play in the one on the right, which is so lovely.
Yeah, I think I discovered Francesca Woodman's work when I was really young, and it's always just stuck with me on, I guess, yeah, if we're talking about the body and the nature of nudity and how one is seen, it's just such an eloquent way of someone expressing that, dealing with their own identity and seeing themselves, which I think is quite a big thing as a woman. You know, I often think you see yourself one way and then the world sees you another way, and you've got to be conscious of both ways that you're seeing and being perceived. And I think to be able to kind of like go into nudity as a theme, and for Francesca Woodman, it's just so clear that it's just her kind of investigating her own self and life and space and structure and setup and like metaphysical ideas. And I just think they're really, as a series of work, it's just, yeah, they're really brilliant.
No, completely. And I think as well, especially the one here on the left, the kind of the sense of power again that you have from this portrait, and a kind of yeah, you know, throughout the history of Western art, the nude woman has been kind of objectified, and her kind of inhabiting this nudity as, you know, as subjectivity rather than object is really palpable.
No, it's true, yeah. And then it's just suddenly brought to mind when I look at them, and they're quite different imagery, but there's a sort of energy between, but you know, Anna Mendieta, I don't know her name right, but I always loved those photographs where she did impressions of her body in the landscape. And you know, there was one where she, I think, laid down, and then there's flowers that outline little white daisies or something, and then there's much more violet ones where there was like, you know, fire being lit, and in a way, you know, some of Francesca Woodman's, yeah, the difference between some are so like soft, and then some are much more raging, and yeah, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a really cool comparison actually that I hadn't thought of. No, completely. And yeah, going further back, I mean, one of the first women to paint herself nude, here you have Paula Modersohn Becker, who many people often think that she's pregnant in this painting, but she wasn't. And other people have read it as, you know, it is a traditional pose of a pregnancy self-portrait, and, you know, maybe it is, she's fecund, but, you know, it's her intellectual birth basically, and this is her kind of, I mean, yeah, it's pretty contorted, but I think you can definitely agree that her kind of like self-possession here is incredible.
The look in her face is so, you know, yeah, it's quite a funny actually contrast, looking at the body and then her face and what.
Yeah, absolutely. And also interesting how she has kind of moved her hand, because obviously you could have it kind of show it painting in the easel, but instead she's kind of imagined it as being there, and yeah, it gives it this kind of monumentality as well, I think, kind of removing all the
and it makes me think a little bit in a funny way of you know, like those older paintings like Crant, is that Crant? You know, like his Adam and Eve and the bodies that they would paint, where you've actually got these really funny, well, not funny, just bellies that
absolutely. And Van Eyck's Eve as well. Yeah, absolutely. These, yeah, like really full bellies, and then like quite slim everything else. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I thought we should also show the wonderful Florine Stettheimer's self-portrait, because it is so gorgeous. And of course, again, you know, as we were saying, referencing Manet's Olympia in her pose, but, you know, saying, this is me, I'm the model, you know, the male gaze doesn't apply here. And yeah, kind of, you know, she's going to hold the flowers herself in this one.
No one's holding them for. Yeah, no, she was such an interesting character. I get the impression. I think I like saw some of her work when I was in New York once in one of the museums, and there's something really amazing about the sort of, you know, I don't want to say kitsch, because they're not kitsch quite, but there's something in, well, yeah, hold up. But yeah, and then that, like taking on that pose and being so just like nonchalant.
Yeah, exactly. It is. I think there is definite humor, but also just lightheartedness in it, which is wonderful. And yeah, moving on as well, Dorothea Tanning's Voltage, which again I think is just such a wonderful, I mean, she often did self-portraits, or, you know, portraits of herself in which she was nude, and I think one could read this as a kind of self-portrait.
Yeah, no, I definitely read it that way, as a sort of self-portrait. And now that you said that, it brings me back to obviously the painting that she did, Birthday, that Max Ernst named for her, but of her topless, and she's sort of in a scene where there's tons of open doors behind her, and it's just interesting actually looking at women themselves portraying their own bodies and the sort of context given, and even this one being, it is a self-portrait without being a direct face. Or
yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, it was interesting what you were saying about the doors, because here the kind of the translation of the eyes from the face to kind of holding them in the hand instead is so interesting. And I think that perhaps doll's eyes, but they also always remind me of that Francesco del Cossa painting of St. Lucy, where she's holding her eyes on a kind of stalk, like a flower. But yeah, I mean, in terms of
they're interesting because they're quite dozy looking eyes. When
I think that is because when you have the kind of articulated eyes in dolls, you know, the ones that sort of close when Like
back. Yeah.
I kind of assumed that was them, but I know what you mean. They're not. Yeah, it doesn't look as if they've been attached to the voltage, shall we say?
No, I do.
But yeah, maybe let's move on to your work, Angela, and talking about Angela Carter and de Sade as an influence on your work, because I think that's a really interesting area. And maybe, yeah, we could talk a little bit about the epigraph to your work, Maximillian William. Yeah.
So I had I had used an Angela Carter quote at the beginning of the press release of the show that I just had, that was in the summer just gone, and I had chosen. I've actually put the longer version of the quote in here, but I had just used "a free woman in an unfree society will be a monster." But for this, I sort of thought it was better context to go further. So, a free woman in an unfree society will be a monster. Her freedom will be a condition of personal privilege that deprives those on which she exercises it of her own freedom. And I don't know why I chose that. I mean, so I basically read Angela Carter's The Sadian Woman, which was on pornography through the lens of looking at the Marquis de Sade and his books, Justine and Juliet, which are centered around two young girls who kind of are thrown out very young and take quite different paths. But she's sort of looking at, basically, I'm sure most people know, but Marquis de Sade's books, they're pretty disgusting. Like, they're quite violent, they're very sexual and vulgar. And I think, the lens that Angela Carter was sort of trying to explore it through was that, pornography as a critique of current relations between the sexes, and also, how looking at this really grotesque way of seeing female bodies and analysing it from quite a feminist stance, even though I really believe Angela Carter has her feminism is very unique to her as a person, is in, I think it's her personality, it's integral. To say that by looking at through the Marquis de Sade, I don't know if I'm explaining myself very well here, but I had to write some notes, but you might begin to penetrate to the heart of the contempt for women that we distort in our culture. And so for her to be brave enough to go somewhere which people on first impression would just object to purely because of the nature of de Sade's work, to sort of look and identify at the woman as a sort of free agent in a way, freedom to be as cruel as the cruelty that women are often dealt. And it's quite funny because I've been reading this book, a new book by Rebecca Solnit, and I've got to try and remember the title, but it's Recollections of My Non-Existence. And it's her sort of going over her life as a woman. And, I came to Rebecca Solnit from reading an essay that she'd written called Men Explain Things to Me. And the introduction, if anyone hasn't read it, is absolutely fantastic. She gets invited to this dinner, and the guy who's hosted the dinner keeps her back at the end, her and her friend, and he's going, "Oh, I've heard, let's just say it's Manet. You wrote a book on Manet, and it's really good. But have you heard about this other current book that's featuring in the charts?" And she had written it, but she didn't say anything. And it wasn't until her friend politely had to let him know, this is the author of the book that you're talking about, and that it was just could not have been a woman that had written this book that was doing so well. She must have written another one. And basically in her new book, Recollections of My Non-Existence, she's sort of going back through her youth and what it was like being a young woman growing up. And she's telling this one story, which I really relate to. It's so funny that, when you're walking home at night as a woman, you're sort of looking over your shoulder if like a man's following you, or, at one point this guy was following her and a car came back and circled around and picked her up because he was like, and she had to choose between being followed by a stranger or getting into a stranger's car. And it was sort of like, which was going to be the lesser of two evils. But I think then it's so powerful and curious to also, look at the way Angela Carter was, how, women have as much agency to be cruel and be independent and not just in opposition of them. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I think you've put it really brilliantly, and I think you know, you've seized on exactly, you know, what she says about one of the reasons why de Sade was banned was not because he wrote pornography, because masses of porn isn't banned. It's when pornography doesn't support the status quo and actually engages with the political realities of the day, and then has the kind of power to act as a critique of the relationship between the sexes. That's when it's banned, and that's when it gets interesting.
Yeah.
And I think it's absolutely brilliant. And
I think she also, I think also in you know, in talking about Justine and Juliet and the way she writes that book, through that book, I think it's really funny because, you know, it's questioning patriarchal ideas, but it's also mocking them, which I think is the point. You know, you want to take a standpoint on what's acceptable, and then suddenly when it's confronted the reality of the nature, it's, so I think it's really brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the kind of mocking nature of patriarchal institutions comes in really brilliantly in this painting, Mr. Peanut. Can you tell us a little bit about the kind of how it came about?
I was having a really stuck time, and really I had this funny period where I had a good 2 or 3 months where I did everything I made was crap. You know, it just was like, what, you get to the point where you're like, why do I paint? Am I any good at it? And I went to the British Museum, funnily enough, and I saw this postcard of Mr. Peanut in one of the vignettes, and it really left an impression on me. And I went away and kind of used that. And I don't know, you know, I really tend not to overthink what I make and why I make it. What I find more interesting is that, for me, you know, when I read Angela Carter's book like that, or Rebecca Solnit book, or an essay, that for me is like momentum and feeds into sort of ideas that just get to revolve around my head. But I don't, there's not a direct or particular, I try, you know, as soon as I sit down and I go, this painting or this work is going to be about this, it almost always inevitably fails and never lives up to my expectation. And I don't know, I just think it, in a way, it is what you're looking at. It's just totally ridiculous, you know, this giant costumed peanut feeding a woman a strawberry in a glove, and I don't know. You know, it just sort of makes sense in a way that I feel like I can't really.
No, absolutely. It absolutely does. And I think thinking about the kind of ridiculousness of the kind of excesses of the patriarchy and the kind of strictures that exist to keep women in their place. I mean, I think this was something that really, to move on to this painting by Remedios Faro, I think the way that this is called Tailor for Women, and the way that she presents these kind of incredible clothes that are at once kind of like sort of flying machines and have these incredible sails, and they're obviously really magical and fantastical, but also at the same time kind of constricting, and the way that they kind of like inhabit these clothes almost as if they're something that they have become part of their bodies almost, is something that I was really interested in, and we should have had a slide with all of the incredible details.
I know, I was just thinking, you know, because when you sent me this painting and we were talking about it, just the amount of detail, and particularly in the woman with the blue, with, you know, she's got her dinner is on her dress, and it's really bizarre. And, you know, and then the one in the purple, sort of her, looks like she's got a tail and yeah,
the kind of all of these pins being sucked towards this magnet on the floor, and then all of these bubbles that are emanating from
yeah.
the right. No, it's really, really incredible details. But yeah, in terms of kind of the body modification as well, I thought this was a really wonderful barrow that you showed.
It's also quite funny because I don't really tend to think too much about, when I started making the work, I was very aware that there was a problem with painting nude women, just because we all know the history of the female nude and how many times it'd been painted by men, and people so frustrated with the kind of like the ideology behind it. But when I pick out a painting like this and I look at it, I just find it interesting, and I don't feel so moved by like maybe, yeah, I don't know, I just find it really, maybe that's a thing where all that stuff seeped in subconsciously and then you gravitate towards these images. But I just think, this is so hilarious, this woman going in with this really long pointy nose and sort of, I know. And also I found it quite funny, it's in 1960, thinking of plastic surgery back then and like how much of a phenomenon it is now is.
Yeah, absolutely. But also just the kind of lack of imagination of most people getting cosmetic surgery. You could have all of these extra breasts and you just get up for two.
Should be fun. Yeah, it's so true.
Speaking of which, I thought I should also bring up the Diana of Ephesus, just because. But yeah, I mean, the figure in the window here is really amazing, and also kind of makes me think of the sphinxes that are often shown.
Yeah.
Multiple breasts, because that was a kind of big symbol for a lot of the surrealists, Lenore Finney as well, and identifying with the Sphinx.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, thinking about body modification, maybe you could tell me a little bit about this work.
Yeah, this one, Emblem for Watermelon, so the drawing came first, and it was like I was saying, I don't tend to overthink things, apart from that I was quite conscious that there's a funny association with Black people and watermelons, and I guess that was the starting point for the drawing, and I guess in the process it just got more perverse and bizarre, and like grew from this. And yeah, it has that feeling, I don't know, yeah, this one is very, very on the sort of lucid between reality and sort of slight symbols of thinking about things like the association of Black people and watermelon, and then just the idea that an emblem, which you sort of have emblems for like family, the sort of, yeah, to analyze it back.
I mean, yeah, I immediately thought of this etching by Dorothea Tanning, which it definitely has lots of obviously unconscious similarities with, but it's so interesting because Tanning this was the first etching that she ever made, and wrote in a diary entry that she just did it to see what she could do with etching, and to kind of and this is what came out, again, without really thinking about it, and that idea that it's kind of almost, as you say, kind of acting first and thinking later, and sort of seeing where the line led her. And I think that it really comes across in all of these works that there's this kind of not fascination, but almost being kind of carried away by materiality, whether that's the pencil line or the paint. It's really kind of leading the way almost.
Yeah, that's so true, because after all, as much as you you're expressing things with art, be it consciously or subconsciously, a big part of it, and which is why I love drawing so much, is that it is just instinctive, and as much as it contains a lot, it's also a process when you are the person making it, in that you are sometimes just drawing or painting and totally involved with that without thinking, you know, too much more than that. And it's so fun, you know, seeing these two images next to each other and seeing that Tanning hadn't thought about what she was making. It was just very much going with the flow and what kind of rolls out subconsciously. There's definitely some universal things perhaps that are shared.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that takes us really nicely onto this manga that you chose, because we were talking a bit about how you can use abstract sort of space, and quite a lot of negative space in this one, but to kind of communicate emotion which you wouldn't otherwise be able to communicate. I mean, maybe you could tell us a bit more about this.
No, definitely. I think the basis of this is I remember when I was studying and I had to like present some meaning behind what I had been making, and my grandfather sent me this essay by Plato on the idea of the fifth, and there being that there are four fundamental things, you know, like words and action and blah blah, that you can make sense of, but by all of those things coexisting, something happens that is the fifth, and it's something you can't see or touch or make sense of. And I read manga from a really young age, and I always found it very interesting that it's able to communicate a lot of things that are a bit like that, in that it's a sensation of something that you can't quite put your finger on. And I particularly, this manga called XXX Holic stuck with me in a really strong way, because this particular bit of the book, this woman comes in to see this witch because she's got like a stiff shoulder and finger, and she feels like something's going wrong, and the witch kind of, she can see all the dark cloud around her, but the woman is unaware of it. So it starts off with just a little bit of smoke on the left, and the second image is taken from further along in the story, and she gives the woman who comes in a ring and says to put it on, but she's lying, she's telling a lot of lies, and like around her is sort of this smoke that's starting to kind of take over and suffocate her, and it's a bit, but she can't see it, so it's kind of like the existence of things that she's bringing towards herself. And I don't know, it just really stuck with me, this weird claustrophobia of what's going on around you and sort of impacting you. And yeah, I think manga's always been really able to communicate a lot of things that can't just literally be explained or said, but can only be felt or sensed.
Absolutely. And I think that feeds really nicely into, I was thinking another artist who did that completely as you were describing it is Munch, and using these kind of shadows as a means of conveying this kind of angst or whatever emotion it happens to be that can't otherwise be conveyed. And just to give you an example here, and you have this incredible shadow kind of engulfing both of the figures. And yeah, to move to your works here, Voluble Intellectual, is it right that you based this on the palette of the Munch?
No, that was just a sort of total coincidence that I sort of saw afterwards. That Munch that we showed, the vampire, that there are so many different versions of that in painting form and print, and just as an image, it really stuck with me. And then when I was sort of thinking about Munch's work and the sensation, I noticed that there was this connection that it had accidentally sort of formed in the colouring. But
because it is that kind of the complementary red and the green really kind of struck all the symbolists, and you know, the red hair became this kind of symbol of sin basically, and yeah, so that's why you have here Munch with this kind of femme fatale, sort of staring green eyes, and the long red hair. But again, yeah, sin as seen by a man, women as an incarnation of
yeah, and obviously Munch was very tormented by his love affairs and relationships with women. I think they were quite violent on both sides, but yeah, it's some very intriguing stories.
Absolutely, and I think this was for a long time believed to be a portrait of his lover Tulla Larsen. But again, I think they have since said that it's more probably a professional model who appears in other works, but that kind of mythology of his
yeah, no, it's true.
But yeah, speaking about hair, maybe we should move on to I love this work. I really love this work. Because again, I mean, if we were talking about how to convey kind of emotion through visual symbol, I think, you know, hair is something which is so symbolically loaded, and I think that the space that is taken up here by the hair, you know, and in the title as well, you know, it's not Kim, it's Kim's blue hair.
That's true.
But I think the dog as well has so much attitude.
I always find hair is quite a powerful thing. There's a lot of emphasis on, you know, good and bad hair, but also I think I was describing this before, but you think of a particular person and someone like Jackie Kennedy or Marilyn Monroe who has this hairstyle that they, or Brigitte Bardot, it's as sort of synonymous with them and their personality. It's hair's like a whole identity, and sort of this kind of funny associations that we put on certain hairdos as being smart or sort of out there or tidy, or, you know, I just think also it's very fun to paint on a sort of like personal level.
Speaking of which, I mean, yeah, to come back to tanning, I love the fact that you know, here the etching came before the painting, and the etching to me feels so much more alive because of this incredible energy in the hair of the dog. And I mean, this is her dog who was her kind of muse and sort of continual inspiration. But yeah, I think the hair here really kind of takes on a life, or fur, I suppose.
Either or either.
Yeah, completely takes on a life of its own. Speaking of which, yeah, to move on to these works, which I originally saw as a very surrealist sort of in structure, but yeah, if you could maybe tell us a little bit about these works.
Yeah, I mean, actually now I'm thinking about it when I'm looking at it, which is quite funny. The painting You Don't Comb the Mirror, I'd actually just made that because I, again, was having a very bad day in the studio and painting faces wasn't happening. And it was actually at a time in my life where I had a really, really bad eczema, and it sort of consumed my every thought, feeling, you know, wake up in the middle of the night, just like, it was awful. And so I had this brush, because a lot of people, you scratch your skin so much and it bleeds, and it's even talking about it's pretty disgusting. But people sort of, I was on online forums like, you know, what can I do about this? And people said, you know, use a comb because it's not so scratchy. So I ended up having this day where I'm sure my condition was affecting me. I couldn't paint. It was frustrating. So I took this horrible comb and I just thought, I'll paint it. And it was kind of amazing in that it could contain its own whole personality as a sort of inanimate object that I had put a lot of emotion and feeling onto.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Amazing. Because yeah, it really, the character is kind of palpable. But again, and we were then looking at kind of hair in other historical portraits, and this was an exhibition where you first came across this portrait of Barbara van Beck, who was a woman in the 17th century with Ambras, syndrome, and she was considered a marvel, and John Evelyn met her and wrote about her in his diaries, and it wasn't until the 19th century that people who were outside of what was considered the realm of normal would be seen as kind of freaks and degraded rather than miraculous. And so you have here a kind of portrait of this very high status woman, which is really so sensitive.
The word miraculous, I think, is great as well, because it is really quite miraculous. And I think, when I was looking at these images, sort of that strange connection, I think a lot of the female surrealists didn't really consider themselves surrealists in the same way that the men who had started the movement did. And this image is quite surreal because you don't often see someone with a condition like that, or you don't really see that, but at the same time it's reality. And it's sort of that navigating on the picture plane when you're making images that may come across as surreal or so far removed from what you understand to be reality, but actually they're not. And in this one, it's a plain simple fact, this is a real condition that this woman had. In the same way, when you describe feelings or things that you feel, you evoke them, and they're not maybe so surreal as they might appear to be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's really well put. I think with an eye to time, I think we're probably going to have to skip through some of these images, which is really sad because we've got more miraculous hair here by Lenore Fleary, and the kind of woman that she described as specifically a woman when she was describing this painting, which I thought was really interesting, and more of her treatment of the male nude and the Sphinx there again, and then a really lovely pairing of that nude with this print by Kate Colvitz, which I think is such an amazing work, and I guess kind of brings us to where we're ending up, which is the kind of figure in an environment, because this print is one where you almost have to kind of extract the figure from its environment. And another wonderful show of scale here. You can see slippers on the right here, 5 by 7.5 centimeters. But I think that brings us nicely into how your figures came to be in an environment, and the meaning of the objects in them. If you could maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Oh yeah, I mean, with this particular painting, there actually were a pair of Balenciaga shoes that I saw somewhere, and as we were discussing it, they looked like an object you'd find in a painting that was just totally unbelievable, sort of made out of toweling material and pointy kitten heels. And I painted them to cool off after having painted a really intense painting, and sort of had this canvas that's, it really like fits in the palm of your hand, just kind of go for it. But I think with the object paintings, they have a strong dialogue because they're all things that could exist within the paintings that I make as sort of as objects, feature or context.
Yeah, I mean, this is just to go back to maybe animate objects or animated objects, which I feel like a lot of your objects are. And I thought, this beautifully done by tanning, this kind of essence of macho and machismo kind of like bursting out of this upholstered beer. But yeah, I mean, so the objects in these paintings now, the environments, I know that we were speaking a bit before about how they kind of changed for you and how you felt differently about them. I mean, what do you think?
I think earlier on when I was painting, partly because I was working from my imagination and sort of finding my feet, a lot of the time the figures just are in a, they're in a colorscape, non-functional background of one sort of shade. And I had remembered someone telling me one time, if you're going to paint a surface, you sort of have to give respect to the whole surface. So I didn't really have that tolerance before. I was interested in the figure, and when I had tried before to sort of like maybe paint, well, I didn't even try really with the objects because I just wasn't interested. And then it was a really funny experience. You know, I had started making those object paintings, I guess, and I had wanted to put my own figures into a situation. And when I started these paintings for the first time, I just had as much tolerance for, you know, the picture in the background or the chair and the details involved and making that come alive. And they felt no less important to the painting than the actual figures themselves. And it was sort of, you know, I really remember painting the chair with the one on the left, the one with the teacup, and just really just, you know, it was so exciting for me to paint that as much as I had found excitement and pleasure in painting faces and bodies. And I think that's a personal thing which I've been able to interweave and connect. The fact that I really love objects in like the British Museum and these extravagant environments, and there is some relationship that you know being built.
Yeah, I think that really comes through in the paintings. You know, going back to the tanning bit, I think they feel kind of like living objects. You can tell that you've really kind of lavished love and attention on every detail. You know, the leg of the chair as if it were, you know, the leg of a person.
And I think that tanning the Don Juan's breakfast, it says so much, doesn't it? Like there's more than it just being a sculpt. You know, it's just like got loads going on.
Yeah.
It's like a joy to look at. You get a lot out of it, I think.
It is. It's ebullient and overflowing. It's too much. I probably will have to end with that, I think. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. What a fascinating discussion, and so thought-provoking, the pairings of images that you brought together, and really interesting conversations you set up there. I was really struck by the Modish and Becker self-portrait, and how you just, you know, that description of the figure and her self-possession. I think that was the word that you used, and it just felt really apt, I think, for Samaya's, as a kind of description of Samaya's figures. And I don't know whether self-possession is a kind of term that, I don't know whether that chimes with you in how you think about those figures.
Yeah, I think, you know, when I had my show open, my grandma came to see it, and it made me laugh because before, you know, she'd said, oh, you know, you're painting these naked women, you know, what's going on? And then when she came to see my show, she just was really, you know, struck by what you'd say the self-possession, and just there was something that she really connected with. And hearing her say that to me was, yeah, I think it's, you know, again, it's not something I like consciously thought I'm going to make imagery that is of these really self-possessed women. They just have their own look and they don't, yeah, they seem pretty unbothered, I think.
Yeah, there's quite a few questions that have come up from the audience around you know, your discussion of female gaze and male gaze, and I'm just going to go to one of them now. It's from Kesterson. Interested in your discussion around the male gaze and the female gaze. She's saying that she's touched on it in her dissertation, which she finished today. Congratulations. And she's asking about your opinion on the female gaze. She writes, I believe it derives directly from the male gaze, and that the female gaze, as it's presented today, isn't the pure female gaze. We have been influenced by the male gaze for years and years, and are there any cases of art portraying a pure female gaze, if that makes any sense? I suppose that is something you've kind of been exploring, really.
Yeah, I mean, I tend not to think too much. The male gaze got me as far as feeling annoyed that I wasn't able to engage with my own body in it being my body that I've always had, and it having the male gaze kind of enforced on it. And I kind of think quite strongly that, yes, I think like the female gaze can't exist solely in opposition to the male gaze, because then your existence is always in opposition and based on something that's no longer functional. And I think women themselves have the capacity for desire and intrigue in their own body, and whether that's female gaze, male gaze, or just being and having and existing. I don't know. Yeah, I don't find it very helpful to I don't know if I'm answering the question right, but for it to be in opposition of the male gaze. I'm not sure how helpful that is in moving forward.
And also even in sort of trying to exclude it and saying, oh no, it's nothing to do with the male gaze, you're still bringing it into the conversation.
Yeah,
no. You play with that, don't you, in your Mr. Peanut, in that image, you know, and with the glasses and it's really fantastic.
It's true.
Just looking through questions. So Claude Reich is interested in the link you make between your work, Somaya, and Philip Guston's. Would you say that the woman you paint is in a way like Guston's hooded figure? You mentioned the mask in the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, Guston is very special to me because I discovered him when I was on my degree, and he sort of came to me, his work came in a time of need, it felt like. And yeah, I think, you know, for me, like those paintings of the KKK, you know, the Klansmen, they're not the KKK, but this idea of the Klansman and the mask, and then, you know, the most amazing painting in the studio, which is literally what looks like a KKK member painting a picture. In a way, I think that feeds maybe in a little bit to what I was saying about Angela Cotter. You know, Philip Guston was self-examining himself, and that he was Jewish and his identity had such, you know, he was born after, you know, World War II, and you have to view yourself through this weird and awful experience that's happened that relates directly back to you and your existence and how other people see you. And in a way, I think, you know, Philip Guston masked up in a way to deal with himself and how, you know, his perceptions of life. And, you know, his name originally was Philip Goldstein, and this was something that he hid. And you know, even in his own existence of something like that, changing your own name is sort of masking. And yeah, I think it's very influential on me. Like I say, you know, as a Black woman, you don't really exist in the historical canon of art. But I don't want to focus on politicizing that through visual imagery, other than just have agency to make imagery perhaps that's masking up, it's extravagant, and in a way it makes space for itself. Sort of gone on around, but you know. Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope that answers.
Yeah. I was thinking earlier about, I was really interested in this idea of sort of, I think you used the phrase cooling off, you know, from painting figures, and that relationship between animate objects and people, or inanimate objects and people, and just thinking about how, you know, I know we touched on it a bit before when we were, before we came on live, but thinking about how your practice might have changed or altered during lockdown, and the kinds of drawings you're doing, you know, when you weren't able to get into your studio. So just yeah, it'd be interesting to hear a bit about that. I think you said you returned to drawing more over this period.
Yeah, I returned to drawing because it's a very immediate sort of process in which you know, paper's really forgiving of what you're doing. And I think being in lockdown, I had more time to slowly process, and I just didn't feel moved to paint in the same way. I think there's a lot going on around us in the world, and it was just a very helpful way to be absorbed in something, you know, and when you're, it seemed like the right time to draw more, and slower, and yeah. But I also think that comes off the back of me having concentrated quite a lot on painting, and you have natural cycles, and I find drawing is a really integral part of my own personal studio practice, just as a way of like working through life and ideas.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I know we've sort of run out of time. I don't know if anyone wants to come in with any last questions. We've run over already, but it's been so brilliant to hear from you both, and for all your wonderful readings of different works. It's been fantastic. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll all be able to meet in person before too long, but we'll see. I just there's a couple of just last questions and sort of thanks for your discussion, but just asking about forthcoming exhibitions. Well, to both of you, I suppose it'd be nice to just end on that note. Thoughts for the future, an uncertain future, but I'm sure you've got exciting ideas.
Yeah.
You go first, Mo.
Okay. Yeah, I've got an exhibition that's supposed to be opening up in LA, and obviously it just depends how lockdowns go and how we work out this year goes. But yes, there are things in the works, but I don't know when they'll be visible. But hopefully February should be the show in LA. So yeah.
And I should say that the contemporary drawing show that I was working on, Pushing Paper, has been on tour, and hopefully will be opening at the Cooper Gallery in Barnsley later this year. And although it is all obviously dependent. And then something about artist studios is another exhibition that I'm working on at the moment. So very topical.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Oh, well, lots to look forward to from both of you. So thanks again so much, Isabel and Somaya, for joining us this evening. And thank you all for listening. And do join us again at the same time next week.